So just, I guess, while we're setting up still a little bit, I was here yesterday, very lucky to see Chris and Megan present with you guys and get a sense a little bit about some of what's interesting to you, compelling to you, what you want to know about. And I'm hoping today that the focus, as I know it was yesterday morning, is really about you as a care provider, you as a teacher, you taking care of these children. Now, I do think some of these exercises will be useful for you in terms of teaching. That's not the explicit focus. So I just kind of want to let you know that we really are focusing on how you can take care of yourself in this workplace, how you can remember what it is that motivated you to join this job. So that's where we're going to begin. Great, here. So our learning objectives. We're going to look at the basic vocabulary and function of emotions, meaning what are they, how do we name them, what do we know about them scientifically. We're going to identify the felt experience of emotion. So we're going to hold certain emotions in our face. We're going to be aware of what that makes it feel like in our body. And also, to do that, think of some memories and really get a sense of what the emotions are inside out from current research, and also, as my friend loves to call it, me-search, right? What do you discover about yourself? And we're going to look also about how emotion and stress are related. Very frequently, people tend to think that stress is its own kind of entity. Stress occurs, it comes onto us somewhat like a virus, and it's with us. However, I really hope today I can convince you, if nothing else, that understanding your emotions will really help you deal with stress. And that's, I think, hopefully a motivation enough to get through this entire learning episode. So learn the signs and science of chronic stress and burnout in the workplace. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, both through your own reading as well as through coworkers and your own experience. I hope to get a chance to tell you a little bit about my research, but really this is focused on training tools that you can use for yourself. I will say that some of the signs and science of chronic stress have shown us that what's going on not only with ourselves but with our coworkers can have such a huge impact on our everyday well-being. And so being able to really recognize that and think about what we can do in very delicate work situations, not just with our kids, but with also the people we work with. And that brings us to the last one, which is, I think you guys might have a vignette here, or we'll hand them out, on how to really develop the practice of professional empathy. So you're thinking, where did we go from emotion to empathy? Well, essentially, when you think about what emotions are, and we'll go over this more thoroughly, emotions are how we relate to other people, how we communicate to other people. And when you're really understanding and looking at emotions as they kind of guide our everyday interactions, a lot of it is about empathy, how we understand other people, how we're able to make what they need and want separate from what we need and want. So we will get into that. Just before we start here, we're talking about emotions, and emotions are very personal. And just to remember that, this is a confidential space in that we don't want to continue conversations outside of here unless that's explicitly agreed upon. That we respect how other people feel. It may be really different from what we feel. Some people in the room may say, I am just tired of problems of the parents of my students. And you may think, that seems so uncompassionate. How could they feel that way? You have to respect where another person is coming from. And I don't really need to tell you all this because you're here, but just to be clear. And mindful speech and listening, meaning, again, be conscientious of what other people are saying, what it might mean to them. And knowing your own limits. This is going to be really important for our emotion exercises. We're going to practice two pretty difficult emotions, fear and anger, and then happiness. Don't worry, we will bring it back to the laughing. But it is important, I think, for us to know how fear and anger feels and what fear and anger originates from in our lives, so we can hopefully avoid or maybe in some ways prepare for those experiences. And are there any other agreements people think would be worth saying? Do we have it here? We have a bunch of therapies. Oh, please refer to the working agreements, which is great. So we're going to start here with a small aspirations exercise. So I'm going to ask everyone to close their eyes briefly here. And just take a couple breaths as you've been practicing well in the last couple days. And I want you to think about the first time that you heard about the Educators Institute. Maybe you were online, maybe a friend sent you an email. And what was it when you saw that this was happening? What did you feel? And then at some point you decided, you know, I'm going to try and do this. So what were the steps that you took? Did you talk to a friend, a partner, your children? How did you explain to them what you wanted to do, why you wanted to come? And then in the weeks before, the planning, the organizing, taking this many days out of your life from wherever you've come from, near or far, what were the preparations you had to do? And what were you thinking? What were you feeling about arriving here? And yesterday morning, just before you began, what were you feeling? What were you hoping for in the room? And after a very long and warm day, hopefully had a restful night of sleep, and I just want you to be in this room and open to this new experience. And for myself, and I know everyone else teaching here and organizing, really recognize the huge sacrifice of time, of energy, and of resources to be here. It's quite a gift you're giving to yourself. Okay. You can come back to the slides here. Now I wanted to get you calm and open because I'm going to give you a lot of information. And there will be group activities. You will have ways to integrate this and understand it, but I really, I think what I can most be valuable at here is helping you understand emotion at a very deep level, and one that I think you can use in your everyday life. So just to give you a quick sense of where this learning is coming from, there is a teacher training called Cultivating Emotional Balance. This was designed in the year 2000 by Alan Wallace, who is the Santa Barbara Institute kind of lead scholar. He's a Buddhist scholar as well as a former monk. He was a translator for the Dalai Lama for 25 years, if that's something that makes you excited. And an incredible teacher. He and my father, Paul Ekman, I'm a second-generation emotion researcher for those who didn't recognize the last name, and they decided that it was really worthwhile to try and create a training that had both Western psychology and Eastern contemplative practices. How do we help people in a way that really integrates that in a meaningful way? So they developed a training, raised a lot of money, and were able to do a kind of rigorous randomized controlled trial, got some good findings, which I'll show you in a moment, and decided to start training people. So for the last 4 years, I've been lucky enough to go to this center in Thailand called Thanyapura, where it's an international mind center, and we do 2 weeks of emotional skills. So 2 weeks of what we're doing this morning in a couple hours, and then 3 weeks of silent meditation retreat. A lot of school teachers come, a lot of basic mental health clinicians from all ages and ranges, people who come and they want to become certified in this teacher training itself. So this is just like a couple images for you guys of those folks looking really happy. It's really sunny. This is when they're still allowed to talk and before the 3 weeks of inward reflection. And this is the article itself. I'm happy to send it. You'll see that it's contemplative emotional training, reduces negative emotional behavior. And these are a lot of local folks here from the University of California, San Francisco. And the key findings I wanted to point out, not just to bore you with highlighting, but that it was done for school teachers. And the entire purpose of this program was how do we help non-clinical, meaning people who aren't deeply suffering from mental illness, but more from the everyday stress of lacking emotional balance. And how do we help these people who have such a great impact in the work they do? So it was done with school teachers. They found everything you would hope to find. People were much happier. They reported feeling more efficacy. But the other interesting and important part was they did a study with the either live-in roommate or partners of all these teachers and had them report on any improvement. And I think when we're talking about emotional life, this is not relegated to the classroom, right? And what goes on at work is what we bring home. And when I talk a little bit more about burnout, you will see that one of the main consequences of burnout is actually what it does to your family life. Of course, we know what it potentially might do for your students, but we also know that that impact can come home with us. Okay. Aha, this really terrifying photo is to give you guys a sense of my own background. So I'm a medical social worker. I was at our county hospital here, a level 1 trauma center in the emergency room for the last 6 years. I recently stopped because I've been working there as I was in school, and they moved from 8-hour to 12-hour shifts, and so I resigned. But it was an incredible education. I can't really look at that long. It was incredible education in really what it means to help people and show up every day emotionally, every single day. And emergency rooms are certainly extreme places, but the encounters are brief. And I think when you're in a classroom setting, the encounters are ongoing. I've had the benefit, I think, of working with a lot of adolescents. There's a local center here for children in social welfare called Seneca Center, some of you may know. I worked in their crisis programs. I worked as a clinical case manager for some of the youth in juvenile hall. And I know what it's like to work with youth and how demanding they are and how the relationship every day can be quite demanding. In the emergency room, it's a very demanding and very brief relationship. However, so important to be able to connect and to build rapport. But saying that, almost as important is not getting too involved and how to balance that. And that's the origin of all of my research and all of my training interest. So it really comes from this place of my coworkers in the ER, if you just said, what creates burnout? Well, maybe burnout is just when a job is really hard, then everybody would be burned out, right? Everyone in here would be burned out because teaching's really hard. There's never a time when it's just going to be an easy semester. There's always challenges. But it's not just that work is hard that burns us out. It's really myriad other factors that have to do with how we're able to take care of ourselves, and not in a cook a good meal and go on a run like everyone tells you for self-care, but really know your limits when you're working with students. Know your limits when you're working with coworkers, managers, principals. So that's essentially where the idea of my research has come from. Now, this developing and reconnecting to empathy and meaning, this was taking the ideas from CEB and focusing it even more on a high-stress workplace. So what is it that's so important? Well, it's really feeling that we can sustain ourselves in work, feeling meaning in work. How do we do that? Well, it's really the interactions that we have with the youth we work with every day, how we feel about the work we do. So this is small images here from a juvenile hall where I did a training with, you met Chris McKenna yesterday. He was my co-facilitator in a training we did in San Mateo Juvenile Hall last October with the staff there and all the juvenile jail guards. Hopefully at the end, if we have time, which is very unlikely, I'll give you a little info on the research data, but otherwise it'll be forthcoming, and I think Greater Good will have information on that. So just to start off here, can we list a couple emotion words? Can people just raise their hands, and I'll one at a time because they can come pretty quickly. Words that you think signify emotion, like anger, right? That's an emotion word. Any other ones here? Surprise. Sadness. Worried. Disgust. Anger. Repulsion. Revulsion. Yes. Embarrassment. Confusion. Joy. We'll give her a moment here to catch up. Fear. Shyness. Yeah. Fear. Contempt or content? Content. That's a good one. Excitement. Anticipation, yeah, anticipatory, yeah. Grateful. Can't believe it took this room that long to get to that one, huh? Okay. Calm, okay. Anxious. Shame. Guilt. Stress.
Happy.
Yes.
Satisfaction.
Sympathy. And empathy. Pride. Apathy. Silly. Confidence. Cranky. Yes, very good. Annoyed. Tenderness. Hurt. Maybe just one more. Whereas confused and powerless? Powerless. Okay.
Frustrated? Yeah.
Okay. So yes, the overwhelming preponderance of emotion words are words that make us not feel that great, right? We have a lot of anger and worry and disgust and shyness and fear, whereas the things that we associate with feeling good, very few. And unfortunately, evolutionarily speaking, we are biased. We have a disposition towards these emotions that are, in fact, ways to protect us, but don't feel that good. We have many more universal emotions that have to do with these anxious, stressful, and guilty experiences than we do with the joy and the coming together and the gratitude. Some of what we're going to talk about today will keep on referring back to these emotion words. These are not all emotions in the scientific term. Now, before we start, scientific term of emotion is useful in making distinctions, but how you feel and what you feel about your life and everyday work you do, you don't really need scientific categorizations. This, I think, will be useful to understand why empathy, for instance, not actually an emotion, scientifically speaking. Empathy is a series of emotional states. We can feel both sad, we can feel revulsion and anger. It's not a single emotion that arises within us. And so being able to recognize each emotion individually, again, I think will help us really understand them and move forward. Here we go. So we're going to start talking about here, essentially, which emotions are universal. And by universal, that means that they have a signal in the face that's universal, and that entirely around the world they are understood as universal. So we have anger, disgust, contempt, fear, surprise, sadness, and then enjoyable. The reality here, and I'm gonna let the cat out of the bag on this one, is positive and negative emotions is not actually a very scientific distinction, because you can really enjoy feeling angry, and sometimes you can even enjoy a good cry, right? So saying positive and negative emotions is something that in this camp of discrete emotion researchers, we kind of shy away from. Now, it's very useful as a teaching tool. It's useful to think about, I want to feel positive emotions. But when you actually think about what's enjoyable, there's many ways. And there's often ways in which even an enjoyable emotion could be so-called negative. If you're laughing at someone else's failure, is that a positive emotion? Not clear. We'll talk a little bit more about what the definition of constructive versus destructive emotions is, which I think is a little bit more useful so we can help understand our emotional experiences. So when you think about why are all these emotions here, what were they hardwired into us? Well, anger, it kind of fights and removes an obstacle. So if you look at the physiology of anger, you actually have blood rushing to your arms. And the sensation with anger is, I need to get this out of the way. This is useful. And you think about a good example of anger, you are running to your car, you see the meter maid about to put a ticket there. There's a little bit of fear. When you get there, you're like, I'm here, you can't give me the ticket. You're trying to prevent at all costs and to remove this obstacle to the $300 fine or towing. And it's useful. If you went kind of, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do it, it might not have the same effect. Anger is powerful. Using it in a contained way can really be important and useful. And I guess I say important and useful would be true for all of these emotions, right? They wouldn't really be with us if there wasn't some sort of function. So disgust. Disgust gets rid of something poisonous or harmful. That was its original intent, but now we can feel, social disgust and moral disgust. If someone is hurting children, abusing children, we can feel disgusted by those acts. And the use and utility of disgust really does kind of allow us to separate ourselves from something that is negative and not good. And the display in our face of disgust, which we'll see here, signals to other people that we don't approve. Don't cut in line in front of me. Ugh, And so contempt and disgust, people have a very hard time understanding, recognizing the difference between these two. With contempt, I like to use the example more of the kind of the alpha silverback primate who is being challenged by a young juvenile competitor. Now, he's not angry, he's not disgusted, he's just, how dare you? How could you think that you could challenge my authority? And the appropriate response, kind of visibly, and you do see this in primates, is contempt. And contempt is an experience that people find challenging to get examples of. When do I feel contempt? Because it can be close to disgust. But in disgust, there's really a kind of dehumanizing element. Like, I don't think you even understand the level I'm on. That's disgusting. Whereas with contempt, you're like, how could you even consider doing this? This is really unconscionable. And we'll see a little more examples of this that hopefully will be helpful in terms of teaching other people with contempt. Not always, with kids, an easy one to translate. We have had a lot of CEB teachers who work in the classrooms. They have kind of their own group email list and are ending up sharing a lot of resources with one another, and they often take contempt out. They feel like it doesn't help with the kids. Though I always call it the most adolescent of emotions. Like, you really see contempt when you see, trying to tell a teenager something they do not want to do. And so, what does fear do? Well, it helps us prepare to escape and to flee and to make plans and strategize. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about fear, because fear is really the origin of the majority of stress and rumination, right? What's going to happen? What's going to go next? How am I going to deal with this? Fear can be totally paralyzing. And though fear would be very natural if a tiger bounded in the room right now, it's not that useful when you're constantly wondering when the tiger is going to bound into the room. When is this going to happen? What is it? And it actually really can create very negative feedback loops, as we all know from feeling high levels of stress and anxiety. So we'll get deeper into fear. Surprise is the briefest of emotions. It's a very hard one to fake. So when you're trying to get people to show anger, you put your brow down, you put your lips together, and you can really get the sensation of anger. But with surprise, it has to be authentically new and novel. You can't expect it whatsoever. And it's the briefest of emotion, meaning when we look at the physiology, it comes and goes very quickly. So sadness, people often question, why do we have sadness? Can't we just eliminate that one? Wouldn't life be better? And in fact, it does allow us to draw connections. We do lose things, and when we have loss, we need reassurance. So the purpose, or the evolutionary purpose of sadness, is supposedly that it gives us this signal that allows people to come around us and take care of us because we are in a weak and vulnerable state. Now, that may not seem the case, if we lose something we love that's an object, like someone steals your bicycle, which has happened to all of us who live in San Francisco at least once. You're very sad. Are you vulnerable to the world? Not exactly, but that doesn't really make a difference for your emotional system and your emotional response. You'll still have this, I need to be taken care of, I don't feel good right now. So that's where sadness comes in. And enjoyable emotions allow us to deal with the rest of this, right? Enjoyable emotions allow us to really come together and to connect to other people, to signal that we are indeed approachable, friendly, and that we want to engage. So the appearance of a smile is actually the emotion we can see from the farthest distance away. And you can understand why evolutionarily that makes a whole lot of sense. You want to know, am I approaching a situation that's good or a situation that is maybe not as friendly? Any questions on this so far? Yes?
I mean, I know that gender operates on a continuum and we're constantly redefining the term, but it seems that there's something certainly gender going on here too. I mean, whether you construct gender within yourself or it's a perception. And as I look at the list and thinking about some of my own experiences, this notion of universality seems to get complicated really quickly.
So, perfect question. Leading up to what we're going to talk to next is absolutely gender as well as nationality, even within a subculture group in the same high school. What are the rules of engagement, right? What are we allowed to display? What are we expected to suppress? These things can be so variable. And when we're talking about these as universals, what we're talking about is everyone can recognize them. Not everyone expresses them in terms of a way visually we can see them. Many of these are also emotions not listed here. There's not a universal signal. People do not know why there's not a universal signal. That could be because they came on a little later in our evolution, or that possibly they're not as crucial. There is, of course, a couple other emotions that people believe are universal, including awe and embarrassment. But again, sorry to be wonky and scientific, for this presentation we're focusing on these. It doesn't mean those emotions do not exist, but we're going to get more into kind of display rules and cultural differences of emotions just here next. So here we have really the definition of emotion. And what I think is really important here about this definition is that, again, emotions serve a purpose. It's important. We have an emotion about things that are actually important to us. There can be many, people often ask, are we always emotional? Is there always an emotion? No. We're not an entirely emotional system or being. Right now, hopefully you're not feeling an intense emotion one way or another, and not boredom, which is not an emotion. But it's really something important to our welfare. It is a response that allows us to cope with new information, situations, settings, feelings, and other kind of stimulus. And that it is really coordinates our entire system. Now, we're going to go through a timeline of an emotion, meaning where does it actually begin, where does it end, and what are the consequences? And you will see that it's really kind of up, down, and moving through. There's not, often people think of a mood and an emotion, that can be a very long time. But actually an emotion responds quite quickly to an event and can pass quite quickly. I always try to give people the example of when you watch, a 6-month-old child. And you see happiness and then anger and then sadness, and it just is coming and going, and there's no rumination, there's no projection, it's just the fluid experience of emotion. And you can see all of those emotions as early, some of them as early as 3 months, but by 9 months all of them are online. Characteristics. So here we're talking about the characteristics, again, of these universal emotions. They have a signal that everyone recognizes, distinctive physiological changes, and they can happen very quickly. And this is a part we'll emphasize a little bit more, but often we're not aware of our emotions as they arise. We may become aware of them as we start to see they're influencing our behavior, or we feel maybe a tension in our body if we're lucky to be that embodied. But emotions really can come on quite quickly, and they can also leave us quite quickly. Sometimes they're leaving us for the next emotion. So people, again, sometimes wonder, can I be both angry and afraid at the same time? So we don't know scientifically exactly if that's true, but what we think to be true from what we know is that you're actually probably angry and then afraid, and happen in very quick succession. And so we can have an emotional experience that's going right back and forth. You think an example of surprise and then fear. Someone jumps at you around a corner as you're walking home, you're surprised, and then you're either afraid or maybe you're angry, like, why did you scare me, if it's actually not a threat? So they're coming very quickly. They're involuntary and inescapable. Now that sounds a little bit daunting, right? If the emotions are involuntary and inescapable, and they have all these strong impacts on us, what are we even doing? Do we have any like chance or hope? And indeed you do. You can find ways to prepare for and avoid difficult emotional experience or destructive emotional experiences. But we also need to give ourselves a little bit of kindness around the fact that our emotions that we experience, they are very strong and powerful. We know that they happen a lot quicker than what we're able to think about cognitively. And I think that people have a very different emotional profile. We unfortunately don't have time today to look at emotional profiles, but I'm sure you know from yourself and your partner or friends that some people can rise to emotion very quickly and come down very quickly. Others, it takes them a while and they stay mad a long time, and it's really hard for them to come down. And so we have an exercise online actually where it's kind of a volcano. And you can create your own volcano for how long it takes you to start, how long it takes you to go on, and I'll give you the info of where to see that online. Okay, so here just to get a little deeper into the differences between emotion, mood, trait, and disorder. So you think about anger. When you're really just kind of woke up on the wrong side of the bed, cranky, right? You're like irritable mood. Sometimes people know where this comes from, and sometimes they don't, to be honest. There can be a way in which we wake up on the wrong side of the bed because we went to bed and watched like a really disturbing movie about human rights and justice, and we kind of wake up like, oh, the world is an awful place, we're never going to be free of this, and so we're upset. But we can also wake up angry and not really know why. And that's why I love that I think someone put tired up there, was that right? Or cranky or tired, which, when we don't get sleep, our emotional capacities are just so diminished in terms of being able to use them well. There are so many physiological things that can really determine how we're able to cope emotionally. And so there's also the difference, though, between a mood and a trait. Some people, they're kind of mean, right? And there's this, I always love to call it like the beautiful black box of, and kind of secret of social psychology, which is there's a lot we know about what parents influence, what our peers influence, what maybe our genetic disposition is. And then there's this thing we don't get, this like character, this temperament, this mood. We don't know. It's, if you wanted to be on the other camp, you might say it's someone's soul, right? That people are different. They have these dispositions and traits that, are kind of defining them. So I'm not saying hostile is, your soul or your trait that we don't understand. But for many people, there are these kind of dispositions that they can't understand, that maybe they even are working on, and they're not sure how to overcome. Shyness, for sure. Do you guys remember the video yesterday where the kid was so shy, talking about how mindfulness has helped him? And I'm sure it has helped him within that frame of being shy. But he will probably be a shy person throughout his life. So to understand that there's kind of traits that are different than the emotional experience. You can definitely be a hostile person who experiences different emotions, but your kind of underlying frame of the world is that way. And then a disorder is when it really is overwhelming, right? And it impairs your everyday functioning. From the classic clinical definitions, when you are no longer to have social relationships, professional relationships, or in the case of students, complete your work as a result of any of these emotions, it becomes in the disordered category. And there's other disorders related to other emotions here, but this is just an example. Any questions on this? We've already covered a lot here. So,
I have a question.
Yes, please.
You're saying that what's not understood is the trait aspect, so that that's not necessarily been traced to any kind of genetic or environmental conditioning.
Good question. Clarifying, there are sometimes ways in which we can identify very clearly. We can determine from some children who've had the misfortune of having an insecure attachment or a disorganized attachment, and we can interpret from their behaviors that, wow, they are always going to be highly anxious or kind of impulsive. And that we can say, okay, we understand where that came from. But there's many people, many non-clinical people, who have these traits, and we don't get it.
When you look at their families of origin and how they were raised, and
Right.
it's not clear.
Exactly right. So, there's a lot about temperament. So when you look at these very early childhood development studies, which I'm sure many of you have, and if you haven't, my God, it's just incredible. Early childhood development, especially with emotion, is just fascinating. I really think Joe Campos, who's here on our campus, was a huge pioneer and really interesting writing on emotion. If that would be of interest to you, I recommend his work above many others. And what we're looking at here is even by 3 months, many of these babies have kind of their own personality, right? A temperament. And we can't trace it. We've been looking at these mothers since they were, in their second trimester. And here these babies come out with all supposedly equivalency, and these babies are different. And so that's what we don't understand. And when those babies become, adolescents, there's so much convoluting information, we get really difficult to figure out what's going on there. So thank you for the question. Anyone else? Yes?
Other than traumatic brain injury, where you see those traits change dramatically
Yes.
in a short period of time,
Yes.
are there other circumstances that
That's such a good question. I don't know if everyone heard that, but other than traumatic brain injury, which actually can create irritability in people and also a very host of unfortunate, dysregulated emotional affect, but are there other experiences that can profoundly change someone's trait? Yeah, I have like a small list of other PhD dissertation research topics I would love to do. And one of them is epiphanies, right? This idea that there are these experiences in life when you hear that hardened, Scrooge-like guy, who knows what, he falls down the stairs and a homeless man helps him up and he's like, I'm gonna, support children and I'm a better person now and everything's clear. And I don't think that's inaccurate. I totally believe that happens. There's no research on it. And when you think of also kind of religious or mystical or spiritual experiences, people often report that they feel and act differently. Now, are they feeling and acting differently? Like, are they kind of creating more of a padding around that initial irritable or melancholic state? Probably, right? They probably just learned a little bit of experience to create an awareness of their, emotional traits as opposed to actually shifting them. But I would love to know. I would love to know if there's bigger differences. Yeah.
What about like addiction or recovery?
Yeah, addiction or recovery from addiction. That would be, man, we could spend all day on how that changes people's emotional strategies, actually. It really does have huge and profound differences. Now, I think there's so much to talk about with addiction, but I think what you really find underlying is there's so much guilt and shame that goes along with recovery. And it even goes along with people in addiction states that it can really distort their ability to perceive their own emotions and the emotions of others. And so there's so much literature on that. I guess suffice to say that indeed addiction changes how we interact with the world emotionally. And so that has a profound impact, right? So anyone who's had a friend or family member know that this person, they don't even seem like the person you used to know, right? They seem as though they're not operating on that same continuum of what's right, what's wrong, what is hurtful to other people. So absolutely, yeah.
Is it scientifically possible to be in a state of non-emotion, or are we always in some emotion?
Great, good question. I don't know if did you guys hear that one? Okay, so is there a state of non-emotion? Right, like right now, I'm not super emotional. Though I have to say, speaking about addiction, I feel emotional. I've worked with so many addicts, and it's really hard to see how much destruction it leads to in the lives and the family. So you can have a little bit of arousal, right? Oh, a little sadness. But generally, I'm not like super emotional right now. And most people, unless it's something very important, right? Like if I happen to tip this thing over, right? Then that would be like a pretty intense like emotional arousal. But there's most of the time we are not in a state of high emotional arousal. Or any emotional arousal. It's really a response to something important. And our general non-emotional state is our consciousness. And it's really kind of, there's also, and people have a hard time believing this, like many times when we're not thinking, right? Well, which you all know in the room because you've been practicing attention on your breath. And ideally, when you're attending to your breath, you're both not emotional and not thinking, and you're this other you. But that's way outside my expertise. I will leave that for Chris and Megan to handle. But yeah, there's many times in which we're not emotional, and it's not an apathy. I like that someone put apathy up there. Apathy is definitely, I would say, like a blunted affect in a clinical term. It's when you're really disengaged. There's many ways in which we deal with our emotions. So if we have an emotional experience, not everybody is going to express it on their face. Not everybody is going to even kind of tolerate it inside, subjectively speaking. We don't know a lot about what it looks like to have suppression emotionally. One of the researchers, main researchers on this, also at Berkeley, James Gross, has tried to understand what happens when we decide to both not show an emotion, but to try as best we can to not feel that emotion. And all we know about that at this point is we're suppressing an emotion, and actually, physiologically speaking, the emotion becomes stronger inside of us. And so often we're trying to suppress these negative emotions. I'm going to use the quotes here just for ease, but we're trying to suppress things like anger, destructive anger, and we're pushing it away. And actually, we're more activated. We're actually subjectively feeling it more, even though we're not expressing it more. And so that's not an example of a non-emotional state, but just in the way that some people's strategies is to really try to avoid emotional response and avoid the experience of feeling anything, right? And I think that can become depersonalized and very dangerous. And we're going to talk a little bit about when burnout reaches that level of depersonalization, where you can effectively kind of cut off your emotions. Sadly, it's a very blunt tool, so it's not just the ones that you don't want, it becomes all of them. So a non-emotional state would really be someone who's actively suppressing entirely. Otherwise, people's emotions will come and go throughout the day, depending on, again, a moment of import, something crucial or interesting to your welfare, which could be just seeing your new friend you met yesterday, who you presented your mindfulness script to, and you're like, hey, and it's a brief, comes and go, oh, that's nice, and now back to attention and focus. Thank you for the clarifying question. Okay, I'm going to move on here. It's felt inside your body, it's expressed, it's seen on the faces of others, right? I mean, what creates emotion in us can be what we see in other people. And we know that intuitively. If you see someone crying, there's a little bit of heart gets squeezed a little bit. What's going on with them? And it also can come from feelings and stories, as we're going to practice a little bit later. And our communication is inherently emotional. We are giving sometimes very big and sometimes very small signals to one another. And it's a very personal experience. It makes it really hard to measure and frustrating for us in the world of science, who'd like to say that there was this emotion felt like this for everyone at this time, and we can tell because it shows in this way. And it's absolutely not true, unfortunately. So now we're going to spend a little bit time on the facial expression of emotion. This is my dear old dad here in the 70s, and he is a research scientist who really pioneered emotion in the 60s, when most people thought that it was something you'd never understand and kind of secondary to your behaviors. So if you look at the Skinnerian view, strong behavior of what emotions are, they're just kind of this byproduct that happens when you do stuff. And this idea of looking at the emotions and that they may have a motivating role in our lives was quite new at the time. And one of the reasons, as I was just mentioning, it's so hard to measure, right? So hard to measure. So he created this facial action coding system. Has anyone heard of that in this room before? It's not super useful for everyday use, but for science, it's very useful because you're looking at each muscle in the face. Not just, I know what happiness looks like or sadness looks like, but what are we not seeing and what are we missing? And so when you have people kind of report on their experiences of depression, happiness, sometimes they'll suppress their emotions in their face. They don't want to show you, but there's still a little bit of leakage. You can still see some things come through. And being able to really understand individual differences in what people are showing through their facial muscles was a big kind of breakthrough in being able to code the facial action coding system. And it's still used in research to this day. So you'll have a big study and they want to know, does someone like this cereal, right? It's a really big scientific question. No. But so they'll ask them, do you like the cereal, right? And then they'll also link them up to, heart rate variability monitors. Does their heart rate show us that they like the cereal? And then you can also look at what their face is showing you. So it's one technique of many that we kind of go in to look at and understand emotion. So we're going to look at the 7 universal emotions here and really kind of get a sense of how we know the facial signals are universal. And then after that, we're going to do a little bit of an emotion free writing exercise before we do some group work. So just to give you a sense, you can see there's a little glaze. We're okay. We're going to get through it. A lot of content. But so we're going to look at these 7 universals here. And if you remember a couple slides ago, we talked about these characteristics, right? So each of these has this universal signal and a distinctive physiology, quick onset, etc. This list is actually 25, but it's overwhelming. This is entirely sufficient. So this research really came out of this idea of how can we know what is universal? And it goes back to your question. If we have differences in gender in terms of what emotions are expressed, we probably have differences, in all sorts of ways. I did a presentation in Singapore 2 years ago, and I was telling people anger can be a really big challenge. And I had someone raise their hand and say, anger is not an issue here. And I was blown away. And I said, okay, well, what is? And they said, fear. And so there was the experience of fear, anger, and controlling and containing anger was being suggested in this, N of 1, but has been shown in other cross-cultural studies by Jeannie Tsai and folks in Stanford, that when you have a whole society and culture that doesn't accept, tolerate anger just doesn't really come into the picture as much. Doesn't mean people don't feel it. It means the expression of anger is not as problematic. And so here the idea was, how can you tell if emotions are universal? Is it just that people watch television and they learn them and then they express them? Well, the idea was to find people who'd never seen television and never had an interface with anyone outside of small tribes. So this work was done in Papua New Guinea in 1966 the first time, then I think 67. Is that right? Yeah. And asked really briefly with a story, if your child had died, if friends had come, if you're about to fight, or you saw a smelly dead pig, what would you show on your face, right? And so I guess I have many exercises that I do with this. I'm trying to shorten it a little bit, but I think it's interesting to create your own prompts for this. So let's say you were working with your kids in the classroom, and you would say, show me on your face if your parents told you something you didn't want to do. Show me on your face if your friend invited you to a party. So to get people aware of a little bit, what are the signals of emotion? And so in this study, what was trying to be proved was that there were these universal expressions of emotion. At the time, Margaret Mead argued that it was all culturally subjective, that in a different part of the world, when someone's happy, they had a frown, and that none of this was universal, and people were very different. And now that wasn't, it wasn't a mean intended or spirited idea. It in fact made us feel that we were much more different as humans than we actually are. So which one do you guys think this is? Friends have come. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just to give you a moment, just seeing someone's sad face, right? Can you already get a little bit of a sense? And even thinking of that a child had died. I mean, especially in Western culture, there's pretty much nothing worse for a person to go through. I say in Western culture because there's been all this study by Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, a sociologist, about when people are frequently in the experience of loss of children in places like Brazil, that it becomes less visible, less showed emotion, even when a child has passed away. How about this? Yes. And this one isn't as clear because here's the thing about the facial expression of emotion. As our faces age, it can become harder to see. There's much more ingrained lines, and the variability is tough. Also, one thing that happens with age is our lip corners naturally droop, and we look more displeased. So you have to kind of try harder so that people will feel good, right? Okay. Yeah, saw a smelly dead pig. Now the other thing that's interesting about emotions is they're a colloquial language. They're something that we inadvertently express, but also we use. You know, so if I'm going, ugh, it doesn't mean I actually am feeling it. I'm showing you like, oh, don't do that. We use them as like part of like slang in some ways within friend groups. And you know, I have a bunch of friends who use, they are entirely exhausted of me reading their facial expressions, but it's really hard not to. I have a friend who he uses disgust so frequently, it's just incredible. Pretty much everything, he's like, he's kind of this half disgust face, and it's part of his whole shtick. And I asked his wife about that, and she said that no, indeed, he has great enjoyment in life, and it's just that disgust is kind of not a facial tick, but you know, kind of a slang, a facial slang language that he has become very accustomed to. Okay, so we were talking again about these universal. They also have this a trigger that can be, you know, universal. We were talking about removing obstacles. And they have a likely action. Now this slide is really preparing us for looking at the timeline of emotion. But what I would like to do here is really, we're going to take 5 minutes, and I would like people, if they could, to write down 3 emotional episodes. And I want it one at work, one in your personal life, and the other as you wish. And this doesn't have to be, you know, super specific. You don't have to show these signals, but anything you can remember in the last 2 weeks or the last month. Oh, work, personal, and then whatever you like. Free choice. And just think about something you remember as being emotional, an emotional episode. People had enough time to write down 1 or 2? Yeah? Okay. So we're going to be using these a little bit later. Just one more study here for your interest. Just in terms of display rules. This was a study that was done in Japan and UC Berkeley. So University of Tokyo, I believe, and UC Berkeley. This was done in 1968. And they were shown these videos. In social psychology, we have these videos called STIM that you use to try and elicit emotions. Now, one of them is, I think you're watching like surgery. I mean, it's disgusting, right? You do not want to be watching this. This is what you're seeing. So this is in the laboratory in Tokyo, in the laboratory in Berkeley, and it's just like, oh God, I don't want to be watching this. This is awful. And then what you have is someone in, you know, we call it the white lab coat effect. I don't know if you guys have heard that term, that you can change the experiment by looking as though you have someone professional in the room. And this was, you know, people talk about this a lot with Stanley Milligram's experiment, where he asked people to electrically shock this Confederate, and when there was someone with a white lab coat in the room, they were much more likely to do so. So they wanted to see also about what is the white lab coat effect on emotion, right? So you have this, they don't know anyone's in the room, this is a hidden video camera, we're watching these participants. Now we have the white lab coat come in the room in Tokyo versus UC Berkeley 1968, right? So you see that white lab coat effect, everything's fine, we're doing good, I'm here in a lab, and he actually makes his expression even worse. He's like, Berkeley lab coat guy, you're the man, I hate you. So again, back to these like display rules. And I'd be curious, you know, because all of us are coming from so many different backgrounds, does anyone have an example of kind of a difference in cultural expression of emotion in terms of the family of origin that they come from, or where they visited or traveled? You know, think of, you know, difference in ways that people act while they're graduating or at funerals or at parties, kind of different display rules and expectations that we have here in the U.S. Yeah.
It's appropriate. Well, I'm African American,
Yeah.
so there, in funeral situations, it is appropriate. You'll see a range where people might be laughing, crying, celebrating,
Right.
joy.
Yes.
Just it's dancing.
Yep. Yeah, and it's very interesting. I bring up like the ritual experiences because they, you know, there's a lot of expectation there of how we're supposed to act and proceed through. They can vary quite a bit. Yeah, did you have your hand up here? Oh, no, sorry. Anyone else? Yeah.
Since you've been to Thailand, the land of smiles, it's pretty hard to smile at everything. It's really confusing.
It's very true. I mean, and actually, for some people, can be frustrating because even if so I know the people who ran the that Tanyapura Center, and when you would try to discipline a worker and say you did this wrong, they would say, and that's not the response you want. You want to be like, no, look sad or repentant, but instead it's like, okay. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, the same thing in Bali.
Yes.
Yes. Fear is the major emotion.
Uh-huh.
Anger is not polite to express.
Right.
Because it may hurt others.
Yeah. Yep. So anger is just not appropriate to express. I kind of wish we had that here, don't you? It's
Well, but then it creates a lot of turmoil,
inner turmoil. Yeah.
We can go to a book about that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I always, all the time, whenever I ask people to give examples of anger, it's road rage, and road rage. And God, it really, it's scary. I agree. Yeah. There's a lot of anger coming out. Mm-hmm.
I teach a lot of Appalachian kids, and anger is like the predominant, like at funerals. When you go to a funeral, it's like there's sadness, but it's predominantly a lot of anger is expressed, and a lot of like punching of hands. And
Wow.
there's a lot of anger.
Very interesting. So yeah, that there can be anger expressed at loss instead of sadness. Yeah. That in the whole realm of psychotherapy, there's a lot of ideas about, especially men who can express anger and not sadness, and what that connection might be. But anyone else? Yeah.
I did my Peace Corps service in Thailand and experienced the smile factor a lot. But one thing that was really surprising was when my student came to tell me that her mother died, and she said it in an excited energy, and it was really shocking.
Huh.
And then to attend the funeral, there was absolutely no display of sadness.
Wow. Right.
Point of view.
Yeah.
No sadness.
No sadness at the funeral at all. Yeah.
That can
Any?
be religious.
Sure. Well, right. If you think that someone.
They're going on to another life.
Yeah. You have to really believe that, I guess, too. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. In the back. Yeah.
With my 3-year-old son, if I'm expressing anger at him for something he did,
Mm-hmm.
he will sometimes laugh. And so that's just a really interesting thing.
Yes.
It makes me more angry.
Right.
I'm trying to elicit a sad empathy. You did something wrong.
Yes. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's hard to say like what's ideal in those situations. I know Greater Good has this parenting blog that you guys have probably seen. That they've gotten into emotion a number of times in reaction, but certainly laughter is like more infuriating if you're trying to set a limit. Yeah.
I lived in Mexico when my daughter was 3, and she's a very volatile, expressive kid. And Mexican children don't really cry or act out themselves.
Right.
So, like, people can.
Yes. Yes. No, I think that's very interesting. I mean, there is such differences in terms of like expectations in parenting, I think, with, I mean, traveling, you always see such a variety of differences in the way that children will act. Where they get upset at your explosive, volatile child, or no?
Oh, preschool, they can do.
Wow. Yeah. Did it change her, you think? Did it make her?
No.
No. Okay. She stayed true. Okay. Yeah.
I'm Japanese American, and I remember growing up, right before my very first piano recital, my piano teacher asked me how I felt. And I remember distinctly saying that I felt embarrassed. And my teacher would say, no, you don't feel embarrassed, you feel nervous. And it wasn't until later that I realized that in Japan, people feel embarrassed. I mean, that's totally normal to feel embarrassed.
Yes. Yeah, there's a great deal of embarrassment research, as someone in the back of the room could tell us about. But yes, it's very interesting how that changes and how our experience of it comes along. But we're going to move on here. So it's just before we do the anger and fear exercises, we'll take a break after that because it's going to be, they're kind of activating, so it'll be good to be able to move around right after. But again, with the constructive and destructive emotions, what are we talking about when we're talking about what is constructive and destructive? I mean, the most simple agreement that my dad and Alan and His Holiness Dalai Lama decided upon was emotions that are in the service of bringing people together. So that's constructive. These are collaborative and kind of making us move forward. And so one of the things we'll do is look at the emotion episodes we wrote and consider if they're constructive or destructive. And things can be constructive in emotion response is when kind of they're in the right amount, expressed at the right time. So if someone, let's say someone, how to give a good example of this one. If someone is telling you some good news that they got a grant to them. This is on my mind because I'm writing grants right now. And they are like, oh my God, I got this great grant. And you're like, that's great. I'm really happy for you. And they know, of course, you're also writing grants, looking for grants. Now there's a way in which they can be happy and you can share it with them. But if they're like, oh my God, I am so awesome. I got this grant. And really, I know I'm so, whatever, just too much. It can actually be a nice and enjoyable emotion expressed in a way that will separate us, right, and create tension and anxiety. And also, there are often triggers to emotion. We'll talk a little bit more about a trigger to emotion is that it's kind of an inappropriate response. If someone says, I got this great grant, and instead of me being like, congratulations, I'm like, I hate you. I really, really do. And that may be part of my experience, but it'll be destructive to express that. So keep it that way. And then, so again, this is more just kind of about matching. That, again, this really important point, all of the emotions can be expressed in a constructive or destructive way. This doesn't mean we can't feel them. But it's about the expression. Are we expressing them constructively? Are we expressing them destructively? It's a good reminder that we don't want to lead a life without emotion. We don't want to rid ourselves of emotion, even if that were an option. If you could even consider what that would feel like, to just have a life in which there was no experiences of anger, no experiences of disgust. It might seem pleasant, but in fact, it would totally remove our ability to interact with the world in a meaningful way. So just that we want to remove the emotions, we just want them to be appropriate to the situation. We want them to be furthering our path towards constructive, meaningful relationships with ourselves and others. So the first emotion we're going to practice here is fear. And so just to give you a little bit more depth here on fear, fear includes anxiety, rumination, nerves, panic, stress. We have anticipation, worry. So these are all under the fear family of emotion. And you can have quite a big difference within a single emotion family, right? I think that having anxiety and having panic can be pretty similar, but having actual terror and having stress is very different. That's a very different experience and a different response. Now, what we know about fear in terms of what it makes us act, how we do, there's kind of the fight, flight, freeze. Probably heard that term. And this strategy of what we think we're going to do, it often kind of evolves over time. So kind of in the canopy, you can imagine that there's a chimpanzee kind of hanging out and it sees a predator. I don't even know what a predator for a chimpanzee is, but it sees a predator. And its first reaction is, I'm going to stay really still. I'm going to see if anyone notices. And then the predator gets closer. And then they're like, I'm going to get the heck out of here. And that's flee, right? And so there's different ways in which we can use the strategies that happen from fear. So you think about fear more in the line of stress. Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't turn my grades in. I said I was going to do it yesterday, and I realized that I still have 4 more to do, and I'm not going to get it done for another day. And so this kind of fear, anticipation, and anxiety, are you going to do the work, Are you going to think of excuses? Like, what is your strategy? Can you manage to overcome the kind of fear and anxiety? Grade's probably not the best example, but something significant in terms of expectations you're not meeting, which can create a lot of stress. Now, some triggers to fear, right, are universal. Like I said, the tiger coming in the room, right? Anything that really is a threat to our actual physical well-being, there's the universal trigger. But the thing is, we learn triggers our entire life. So we are not born afraid of guns. We don't have some sort of innate understanding that guns are bad. But from a very early age, we become so accustomed to being afraid of guns that if someone walked in with a gun, we would need to think, I think I'm afraid, I think that thing could hurt me. No, the trigger is built in. We are immediately afraid there's someone with a gun in the room. We know the difference between a gun and a cup of coffee, right? We've learned that trigger. And so it's important to realize that a lot of the triggers that we learn may no longer serve us as we get older, right? And so you think about a lot of experiences of childhood trauma that people have, and they become afraid of things that later in their lives they really don't need to be. And yet that trigger is gotten in, and my dad likes to use the example of a fish trap. Easy to swim in, but you can't get out. There hasn't been conclusive evidence on triggers about whether or not you can entirely eliminate them. You can prepare and avoid, and that's about it. But you have to know them in order to prepare and avoid. Yes?
So how much work has been done on people? I get the idea, that people have the initial response to the trigger, but then how much work has been done on what people do with that? Some people will react to it and be proactive, and some people will do nothing and be paralyzed.
Sure. Yeah, and that falls into a couple different lines of research, like efficacy or self-efficacy, and this idea that do you think that the solution is inside of you or outside of you? Do you think you have the power to do anything about that feeling? And so people look at what leads to that. And there's a great scientist named Albert Bandura, who's written on everything because he's incredibly prolific. But one of his ideas that I really like is dynamic interaction. What allows people to react in terms of an efficacious manner? I can handle this, I can do this. He says the dynamic interaction is, how you're feeling at that time, everything you've learned up until now, your disposition from your family. So it's this dynamic interaction of all those things. And there are typologies that people develop in terms of people who have this kind of coping or resilience. And those are two different literatures. So a lot of people have written about this. There's not a short answer other than it is a pattern. So some people, feel a certain inability to cope with that fear, while other people feel less so, and that they do have kind of an internalized sense of power and control. So the literatures are internal, external locus of control, coping, and resilience that really hit those. Thank you for the question. Right, and so again, do not turn off your emotions, but if you can identify triggers that lead to destructive experiences, you're going to be in a good standing. So we're going to do 2 exercises now. The first one we'll do here with fear. It says anger. Don't pay attention. And what we want to do. Most people have an iPhone with them or something like that, or because you can see your face in it, which is sometimes helpful, right? To use a mirror. They'll sometimes find that to be really difficult, and you'll end up accidentally doing the laughing exercise just because you're like, oh my God, that's hilarious. And I will say, though laughter is totally your friend in other ways, in this exercise, it's really your enemy. You really want to try and focus, and feels kind of funny to be making these faces. But we're both going to think of an experience of fear. I'm going to just move that along because it says anger and it's confusing. We're going to think of an experience of fear, and we're going to make the expression of fear. So this is fear. Fear is really here in your neck. Right? There's a lot of the action here. Surprise is a very slack jaw. Right? And your eyes are open. So fear and surprise can look somewhat similar in that often the eyes look very, what's happening literally is you're trying to get a greater focus on what's occurring, both with surprise and fear. So you have a lot more sclera visible. These high. But with fear, there's this tension here. And you will feel the difference in making that than if you made a surprise. So I'm going to ask you first to consider an event of fear, and that can be something that was stressful or something that was actually scary, right? But I'm going to really encourage you to know your limits here, right? You're in this contained space, and sometimes it can be quite intense to have like a fear episode. So try and pick something, not your most extreme and not the most neutral, but somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to give you first, literally just 2 minutes to close your eyes and think about that episode. After that, and in your groups here, and after that, we're going to practice the fear face just for a moment. And the entire objective here is to hold it on your face for 30 to 40 seconds and just see if you feel anything in your body. There's quite a range of places in which people feel it, but these are 2 portals into understanding your emotions, both through eliciting it in your fear and understanding how that feels, and eliciting it in your face. So take a moment to think of a fear episode. Is this clear to people? Understand what a fear episode would feel like? So example would be you thought you lost your wallet, you thought someone stole your car, you thought that you were going to get fired from your job. And what I want you to do is, in as much detail as you can, think about that episode. What happened? What were the steps that were going on, right? Where were you when you found out? What was going through your mind? What did you do after? Okay? So we're going to start at this moment here. And I'll give you just 2 minutes here to think about this. Okay. And now, pretty quickly, just for 30 seconds, and again, I know it's hard to not laugh because it's kind of funny to see these expressions, but if you have a phone, you can do the backwards camera and look, but if not, just practice. We're going to hold it literally just 20 seconds, but holding that kind of fearful expression in our face, and I want you to start now. Okay, so now we're going to do anger, a very brief happiness to get us back into the right realm, and then we'll take a break. So just 5 more minutes before break, okay? So anger, again, you're being thwarted. This is the theme, meaning like what's underlying this emotion. And the message, get out of my way. And it controls, it punishes, it retaliates. I mean, who in this room doesn't use anger in their classroom sometimes? Right? I mean, you have to, right? You can't always be nice. You can't always just be so friendly and command so much respect that your students do what you say. Anger is a very powerful and important tool that we have. However, people often feel that they become overwhelmed by anger. There's very few people who enjoy anger. They're not all sociopaths, but many of them fall outside the realm of people you'd want to be friends with, for sure. But some people really just like, yes, I just told them off, it feels good. But most of us, after we get really angry, we feel pretty bad, right? Like it doesn't feel good. Sometimes you can feel sick, depending on the level of it. And what people really want to change is just their level of anger, right? We did this at a couples workshop recently, and I just think that it's a unfortunate and very real part of being also in a romantic partnership, is your expectations and your feelings about someone can lead you to anger. Now, anyone who knows John Gottman's research knows that we prefer anger to disgust, right, or contempt, that it makes us at least feel that we're still involved and expect something of someone. Though the research showed that when couples showed anger, they were less likely to divorce in 5 years. When they showed disgust and contempt, it was pretty much a sure sign that they were done. So anger means you're still kind of in there in the relational context, but it's definitely something that we would like. I think if anyone already has full control over their anger, they can go to break early. But for the rest of us, I think there's always some room for improvement here. Okay. Anger ends up being, other than that workshop I did in Singapore, often one of the principal points of doing this exercise, of really helping people understand tools to deal with their anger. I wish we had more time to do that today, but this is just kind of a first tool, which is recognizing how it feels, recognizing what it looks like. What we do with it a lot is kind of trying to understand its triggers and whether or not, what was inappropriate about it. Was it you shouldn't have been angry at all, you should have been just kind of sad or disappointed, or was it your anger was right, but the intensity was too high? So really understanding a little bit deeper about what the anger episode is like. So again, I switched my slides here, but we're gonna do first an anger exercise for just a minute and then write, and then we'll do the face of anger, which I don't know what this says about me, but I love making the anger face. I find it to be pretty interesting. You can see here there's such a variety. Like in the middle, we have this seething anger, but almost all of them is the brow down and the eyes wide open. Some people can slack the jaw, some people put it together so even your lips become white, your chin can become puckered, but it's really kind of that brow and that eyes being open against the brow, often here. Okay, so think, and again, especially with the memory of the anger episode, be gentle. Not the biggest, I'm so angry about this, I'm still angry about this. Something in the middle. So try to be a little easy on that. Okay, great. Okay, so anger episode, mid-range. Please close your eyes. We'll do this for just a minute. Again, as many details as you can, where you were, what was happening, who was there, what occurred. Okay, so yes, and in the jaw, and the teeth kind of clenched. So here we go. All right. So we're going to take a break now. And when we come back, we're going to do a quick happiness reminder here. Smiling is so easy to make us feel good, as is coffee and snacks. So we'll be back at 5 to 11.